All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Insights on Writing a Consulting Resume with Matt Hurlock. We're very much looking forward to this presentation. Feel free if you have any questions. We'll have time for Q&A, or I'll also open up the chat to allow you to ask some questions as we go through. So without any further ado, Matt.
Cool, thank you. So thank you all for coming to tune in to learn how to write a consulting resume. As Olivia said, I am Matt Hurlock. I am the current president of education for the Johns Hopkins Graduate Consulting Club. But I just want to start by giving a little bit of information about me. So I am a fifth year PhD student on the Homewood campus with Dr. Yumi Kim. I study a cellular process called meiosis. If anyone's interested in that, we certainly can talk about that later. But I wanted to emphasize by saying that I am still a student and have had pretty decent success being invited to consulting interviews. So I wanted to give sort of a snapshot of where I'm coming from, just so that you can have an idea of, that anyone can do this realistically, because I don't have any exceptionally amazing credentials. So I did my undergrad at the University of Delaware. During my time at the University of Delaware, I worked as a resident assistant. I did some teaching assistant work and was off and on involved in different types of outreach work. Like I said, I am now a PhD candidate here at Hopkins, have had more time to be a teaching assistant. And then my other primary club-facing role has been with the Johns Hopkins Graduate Consulting Club, in addition to continuing varying degrees of outreach work there. And starting when I graduate sometime this late spring, early summer, I will begin a position as an associate consultant with ZS Associates in the DC area. So I just always like to start by giving an idea of what I'm hoping you'll be able to take away from this presentation. The main thing is being able to write a resume, obviously, but deeper than that, being able to understand what positions are applicable for you if you're looking to get into the world of consulting, being able to dissect sort of what the key elements of a resume look like and how you can sort of pull that away from some of the other application materials that you may be asked to complete for consulting or for other career paths that you may be considering. And really giving you a good foundation to start writing a resume. If you don't have a consulting resume ready, I'm sure you all have something prepared, because that's how you got into Hopkins at some point. But there are very specific things that can help a consulting resume stand out. That'll make it easier to read from the end of the person reading it. And we'll give you a better shot of getting an opportunity to interview with the firm that you have that are interested in. So sort of backing up before we get to the resume part side of things, just trying to give you a better understanding of what consulting positions are available for JHU students. And the short answer to that question is it depends. So it very much depends on primarily what your degree type is and how much experience you have. So I'm sure there's a mix of many different degree types here. So I can go through very quickly sort of the types of titles that you'll be looking for. So when you leave Hopkins and you're going to be entering the job market, if you're going to have an undergrad degree or a master's level degree that's not an MBA, you'll be looking for terminology like analyst. Some consulting firms will call you a consultant, so it does depend a bit. But for the most part, especially for the larger consulting firms, the more popular consulting firms are going to be looking for this term analyst. The primary roles of an analyst are going to much more face the data sides of things. So they're going to be collecting data, they're going to be cleaning data. They'll be building some slide decks that will eventually get presented to clients. They may conduct primary surveys with, like, for example, if you're in healthcare consulting, you may have conversations with doctors, you may have conversations with people at pharma companies. But primarily at most consulting firms at this level, you won't have as much face-to-face contact with the client themselves. They tend to leave that to the consultants. So you'll be graduating with a PhD or an MBA, or if you will have a master's degree plus 2 to 4 years of industry experience in whatever field of consulting you're trying to enter, then you'll look more towards these consultant or associate level positions. It really depends on the firm's preferred terminology. And then it gets even more confusing when they use terms like you're an associate consultant, and there can be many tiers. So it's good to get in contact with people within a firm's HR department to try and figure out what positions you should actually be applying for. Realistically, the work that a consultant does is just a slight tier above what analysts do. And on many consulting teams, analysts and consultants will be working together on a lot of projects. The only difference is consultants are more likely to have more direct face time with clients. They may be more so leading the meetings that you have with the client as opposed to just presenting a section. And usually on a small scale, when not dealing with the project manager, they may be in charge of helping to guide the analyst through some of their processes. And then finally, if you happen to have a more significant amount of experience, you have a master's and many years of industry experience, and maybe you have experience as a manager or leading some type of team, you may even be able to shoot for a manager level position, which realistically encompasses all the skills of both analysts and consultants, but then wraps it up in being the person who's sort of the point person for a project, is much more frequently going to be in direct contact with the client. They also will have some responsibilities for selling work. So convincing an existing client to buy another project, or using their networking skills to maybe bring someone in from a very basic level. And so before you start writing anything, it's a good idea to have in mind what job it is you're looking for. So once you've determined what your skill level and experience level are appropriate for, you can start to really understand what elements your resume should have in it. So this is an example of a short job description that I took from an analyst position that we had come through the club at one point. A lot of words here, but generally speaking, you can think of a job description as being a sort of your first filter into whether or not a position is going to be right for you and whether or not you should apply. The caveat that I would give here is a lot of times things that are included in job descriptions are much more often more of a wish list scenario. So don't assume that because you don't perfectly fit the mold of whatever a job description says, that job is automatically not applicable to you, because they truly are trying to find someone who best fits their mold. And if a perfect candidate was to come through, these are the qualities that they would have. And so what you're doing when you look at a job description is you're trying to pull out some of the key terminology that you would want to convey within your resume, not necessarily using the terminology directly as buzzwords, but more so being able to tailor the experiences on your resume so that they hit some of these major points. So the job description itself is going to have probably a little bit less in terms of exact responsibilities and requirements for employment, but there will be things in here that you can pull from and sort of infer some additional roles if they're not listed in the responsibilities section. But like I mentioned before, you can see here for this analyst position, there's a lot of research being conducted. You're going to be designing deliverables to give to the client, to give to your team, to give to your boss. And then, the presentation of all these things together may fall on you, it may fall on a consultant, but the overarching goal is to be able to pull out some of these roles that you're going to be having inside of this job. And then, like I said before, in addition to looking at the job description and some of the responsibilities, you want to look at the qualifications, because that's realistically what you're trying to more directly convey with your resume. Like I said, the caveat here being that this is realistically a wish list, and you may not check exactly some of these boxes in terms of having the exact engineering experience that they may be looking for this position, or maybe, you have a bachelor's degree and you have 1 year of experience or a year and a half of experience when they want 2 to 3. If you have other experiences or have been in a role for that year and a half that makes you more marketable for the jobs or the qualifications within the job itself, it's not necessary to, pass on this. And so you can see from looking at this job description that we have more things that you want to try and talk about in your resume. Again, I would avoid putting these phrases directly on your resume, because quite frankly, it just doesn't convey what you're trying to say in the correct way. The way I usually put it is, if you're funny, don't tell me you're funny, tell me a joke, right? So think about these qualities that are listed here and present the experiences that you have that demonstrate that you actually have some of these skills, rather than directly saying, oh, I have good oral and written communication skills. So I like the way that McKinsey and Company summarizes some of the qualities that they look for in the interview process. So this is specifically with regard to their fit interview process. If you're exploring consulting, you may have heard that term before. It's kind of like your personal interview. So they summarize it into, realistically, it's these PEI categories, but they also have problem solving listed on their website. And so I would say for all consulting roles, you'll want to keep these main categories in mind. Again, specifically, if you're going to apply to McKinsey, definitely have these in mind. But I think these really nicely summarize what consulting firms are looking for from a very general standpoint. So rating your personal impact, having a good representation of entrepreneurial drive, and then some type of leadership, specifically if you can make it inclusive or present specifics to how you've helped people grow. Those are good ways to talk about these 3 points. And then obviously consulting is inherently a problem solving heavy field. So McKinsey lists it there. And if you look at that side by side with some of the phrases that we pulled from that job description from earlier, you can directly see how some of these categories can line up. And moving from there, I think the biggest question that people will have with regards to what do I put on a resume that I'm going to submit to a consulting firm, the main thing that you really want to think about is ultimately at a very basic level, even if you're applying to a consulting firm that focuses in healthcare or in pharmaceuticals, you want to remember that consulting is inherently a business-facing career path. And so what that means is, for a lot of us, especially coming from Hopkins, we're either in the sciences, we're at the School of Public Health, we're doing things that aren't necessarily direct business training. So we have to get a little bit creative in terms of how we display some of these more business specific terminologies within our resume. And so if we take some of those major headings that we had from the McKinsey PEI interview elements, we can kind of break these down into some of the spaces that are good for you to have and experiences that are good for you to have on your resume, and how to convey that you would be a good fit as an analyst or a consultant. So when we think about personal impact, you can summarize that or say that differently as, we're enacting change, we're accomplishing something. So if you're in a degree type where you have to write a dissertation or a thesis, that naturally has some weight to it. Performing research directly, anytime you've had the ability to mentor someone, and then outreach efforts kind of extend over into some of these other areas, depending on how into the outreach you were. So there is overlap between these areas, but these are just some points to kind of spark what you're thinking about in terms of what fits into each of these categories. And we'll go through some resume examples later on, and I'll actually show you my own resume, and I can show you, what worked for me. From an entrepreneurial drive standpoint, this is probably the one that most people will feel that they have no experience with because they didn't start a business. I think that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about entrepreneurial drive. But realistically, consulting firms are really interested in seeing that you've taken initiative to get with something financial at some point, right? Or have drive in beginning and establishing something, because that's exactly what you're doing when you start a business, right? So if you started a club on campus, that's going to be right in line with this entrepreneurial drive. Same thing as if you're in an existing club, but maybe you were the treasurer and you manage the budget for the club, or maybe you have to manage your own budget, for your research project, or maybe some of the outreach efforts that you've been a part of. Especially if you've been able to obtain funding for one of the things that you've been working on, because that not only indicates that you can manage money, it also indicates that you can communicate to someone and convince them to give you money, which is part of that selling aspect of being a manager, which I haven't talked about this. The career path for consultants typically are you're a consultant for a couple of years and then you become a manager. So if you can start to demonstrate some of those skills that are even applicable for the managerial position, they know they can be more confident in hiring you because they know that you'll be comfortable performing that managerial role when the time comes for you to step into that. Moving to the leadership side of things, this is the one that I think is a little bit more intuitive to people. So if you led a club, if you led some type of inclusion initiative within your department, for example, certainly certain types of student government. And, I put unique tasks here because there's a very wide range of things that you can do to convey leadership. And there's many instances where you don't necessarily even have to have an official leadership title, but you can sort of describe it in a way that it still fits that leadership category. And then finally, the last thing that you really want to be conveying with your resume is that you are a good problem solver. So if you're doing things like performing research, maybe you have some personal experiences that help to convey that you have experience solving problems in the past. Certainly, if you've had any opportunities to solve real business problems, those are very helpful. And I put on here case competitions and pro bono projects as really good examples of that. And the main reason that these things are important is because always keep in mind that your resume is sort of the first impression that you're going to make with someone from the hiring department at this consulting firm. So while keeping all of these major points in mind, we also want to keep in mind that this person is probably looking at resumes all day long. Maybe they're working very tightly with an application deadline that just ended and their boss is telling them that they want to have candidates invited for interviews within a couple of days. So they may be reviewing these things very quickly. So in addition to having all of the content that you want included in your resume, you want to be very aware of how you're presenting all that information. What I mean by that is, first, make sure that you're being as specific as possible while also being concise. Generally, each piece of your resume, every sort of qualification that you want to outline, you want to try and get that into a single line of text. Very important for consulting resumes is also quantifying your experiences. So, for example, you might say, oh, I led a team and we did this project. A better way to convey that is telling how many people were on the team, what number of groups was the team itself in charge of, how much money did you manage? And then in addition to that, also being able to describe or even quantify the outcomes from that. The team was able to produce a 10% increase in efficiency of process X, right? So those things together not only convey that you have accomplished things, they also convey that you're able to achieve results in just doing things. It's one thing to be involved in something, it's another thing to achieve results. But this also, by writing this way on your resume, also checks that box of being a good communicator, right? Don't tell me you're a good communicator, show me that you can communicate. And if you can succinctly on a line state something you did, what the importance was, what some of the impact was, they'll be able to infer that you're good at communicating, at least from a written standpoint, directly from that. And then finally, and probably the most important for people that are outside of the business realm, is provide some context. So we, coming from the sciences, coming from the healthcare field, may have a really good understanding of what it is that we do. And we may feel that certain descriptions of things are really putting it into layman's terms. But I would strongly encourage people to try and avoid using more complex terminology as much as possible, and really getting to the root of what it was that you were doing in every task that you were performing. And the main thing that we're doing as we provide all these things, again, because we probably aren't coming from a business background, is you're almost taking time within your resume to show why it is that you deserve this position, right? Because there are plenty of people that are experienced in business that could be taught some of the fundamentals of what we know. And it's not necessary to hire someone with a health-facing degree or a science-facing degree. So we almost have to go out of our way to sort of convey our experiences in a way that they look like something that could easily translate into some of that more business-related content, so that the firm can be confident that when they hire us and we go through onboarding, that we will relatively quickly pick up a lot of that business acumen and the ability to think from a business standpoint, and it won't inhibit our ability to perform our job. So the next thing I wanted to go through is sort of outlining the differences between some of the application materials that you may be asked to write about, specifically by talking about the three that I think everybody hears about at some point as they move through the academic space. So resumes are the thing that is going to be specific to consulting. Typically, they will say a consulting resume can be 1 to 2 pages. I would strongly recommend that you keep it to 1 page, just because, again, it's just easier for people to read, and you can pack a lot more interest. You can pack a lot more information into a small space. And the reason I usually say to do it that way is because I think as people are writing their resumes, they'll commonly think, oh, I don't have enough space. There are Fortune 500 CEOs that pack their full career into a single page resume. And if they can do it, certainly someone who's just starting out their career can also do that. The important thing here is that it's a good exercise to keep it as short as possible, because it helps you really think inside and understand what of your experiences are the most relevant, and really challenges you to convey those in a concise way, which is a good exercise to get into for consulting, because it's very similar to the way that you'll have to give presentations. Because you want to keep in mind, the recruiter at most, if they're cycling through a full stack of resumes, is probably only going to look at your resume for 1 to 2 minutes. In more extreme cases, they may only look at it for 30 seconds. So you really need to make sure that you're giving them something that's easy to hold, easy to look at in one instance, easily read, and then can be moved on, so that, you know, they can very quickly understand that you're a good candidate. One thing that gets tossed around a lot in academia is our curriculum vitae. There are no page limits to these, and they're really just a sort of a dump of all of your experiences. And again, these are typically unique to university positions. Sometimes consulting firms will say it's okay to submit one of these. I don't know that that's necessarily true. So I would really work to have a business resume if you can have one. But if academia is something that you're considering, or you already have a CV available, I would say put all of your experiences you can on your CV first, and then you can use that to feed into your resume and really narrow down some of these points that will show up. And then finally, thinking about sort of the cover letter that can come up when applying to consulting firms. This is also very common. Usually you want to keep it to a page, and you're more so providing a narrative to your application. So your resume conveys your most significant skills and experiences. Your cover letter will explain why it is that you want to pursue a role in consulting, and then also why is it that you want to pursue a role in consulting with this particular firm. And again, this is just as important as the resume, because especially for us coming from backgrounds that aren't necessarily directly business facing, we almost have to go out of our way to justify why it is that we want to move to consulting. This will get read typically after your resume. So the resume is sort of this, first wall that we have to get through in order to, touch the recruiter's heart to make them think that it's good to give us a job interview. So in terms of the layout of a resume, the main takeaway that I think you should have is the resume should be very clean. I know that there are types of resumes that go around where people get a little bit more creative in terms of colors and borders and layouts and, the types of presentation of things that are there. I would say, as far as consulting goes, it's very business oriented. And again, you want the person to be able to get the point pretty quickly. And as boring as it may seem on paper, the traditional resume style, at least for now, is still going to be the best way to convey that. If you were going into a field like graphic design or maybe certain types of analyses, you might be able to have some of those flashier things. But I think something that looks approximately like this, with some room for creativity, is the way that you want to go. You'll want to have your typical formatting in terms of same as you would writing a term paper or a thesis, for example, comfortable font sizes, comfortable margin spacings, single spaced. You want to have your headings outlined clearly. Some people go as far as this resume example will have their headings have physical bars, as long as it's clearly delineated what is a heading and what's not. Usually that's good to go. And then, some of these other things, no colors, and the layout you want to be landscape or portrait. Don't make it landscape. So there are some very general do and don't practices when we talk about resume writing. So some of the things that will help your resume stand out, in addition to having some of those basic qualities that they're looking for in terms of a candidate, is the way you're able to convey those experiences. And by doing, the best way to do that is using diverse and active verbs. So instead of saying I was a part of a team, say that you led a team. Instead of saying I performed research, say, designed and implemented a project. Be very direct in terms of what it is that you're doing. And it falls again into this idea of being very specific while also being concise. You choose the correct active verbs in describing what it is that you did. You won't have to be so verbose later on to, describe the specifics of that experience that you might have. One thing that can help is by condensing similar experiences. I'll have some examples of that when I show you my resume. And then again, two very important things, I would say, potentially among the most important things once you have the actual experiences that are necessary for consulting, is being able to quantify those experiences and then being able to provide context. And usually that's outcomes or whatever the significance of what it is that you were doing. Some of the things you definitely don't want to do on a resume is lie. Don't say you did something if you haven't done it. Don't say that you're proficient in a coding language or, using Microsoft Office if you really aren't. It's just not a good idea, because then you'll have to learn it later or we'll get caught later. But a big caveat to that is don't cut yourself short either. And I think it's easy for us to think that an experience isn't appropriate for our resume, but if you word it the right way, you really have some things in your past that are actually very good to have on a resume and convey some of those important skills without directly saying I have these skills. Again, we don't want to be overly verbose. We don't want to be using all of the big words that we learned while working on our degree, because the person reading it may not get anything out of having those present. And one rule of thumb that I usually tend to follow, try not to use more than 3 bullets under each piece of experience. I'll show you what I mean by that when we go through the resume examples. That's more of a cleanliness thing, easiness to read type thing, but I do think it's relatively important. So then, you're thinking about all the things that you're going to put on your resume. The next thing that you have to think about is how you're going to organize those things. And I would say, from a very general standpoint, there are some sections of a resume which are always present, or usually present in some way. Those are obviously going to be your contact information. Almost everyone includes some amount of their education on their resume. Naturally, the professional experience is sort of the main chunk of the resume. And usually people will dedicate a section to talk about additional skills or highlight different languages that they know. One of the things that I want to highlight as we go through these examples too, is there's a lot of room for personalization, right? So you can choose to break up your resume however you want, and you may be able to demonstrate some of the ways that you think by breaking up your resume into different sections. Sort of, again, that implicit sort of, here's how I organize things, here's how I think through, presenting information to people. So you may specifically, in addition to professional experience, choose to highlight your leadership experience. You may choose to highlight outreach experience. And then you can choose to give more light to some of these other, I think, what people would consider to be softer sections. So interests, achievements, and then specifically highlighting a set of skills if for the position that you're looking for. Maybe you're specifically going to be a data analyst, or you're going to be an IT consultant, and it's necessary for you to have a section devoted to some of the additional IT work that you've done that isn't directly conveyed with the employment experiences that you have. So there's some fluidity in terms of what you can have in your resume. And again, you're writing your resume, it's almost the same thing as writing a book, right? Each portion of a book has chapters, they're delineated in certain ways. Your resume is kind of the same way. You have things broken down into different sections, and the way that you choose to break those things down says something about how you communicate, but it also is a good way for you to kind of organize your thoughts, and whatever seems to make the most sense to you, I would say, is the best way to go. And so I had popped up a resume example before just a second ago. So we're going to look through sort of these individual sections very quickly, talking through the contact information section. It's important to have contact information on your resume, obviously, but you also don't want it to take up an excessive amount of space. The best way that I've found to be able to preserve space in your resume while also getting the necessary points across is formatting the way it is here. having your name in a slightly bigger font than the rest of the document, maybe bolded, along with the pertinent contact informations, websites where people can find you, delineated in one line, broken with these little line breaks here. Very concisely, you don't have to put your full permanent address in there. You'll see when I do mine, it has the town in Maryland that I live in. The professional websites are a nice touch. If you haven't done it already and you have a LinkedIn, I would recommend going to your LinkedIn page and customizing the physical link that people click to go to your page. For example, you'll see it at the end when I put my contact information up. The link to my LinkedIn page is just linkedin.com/n/Matt Hurlock. And you'd be surprised how many names are still available without having to have a ridiculous string of numbers and things included there. So that can be a quick way for you to be able to convey on your resume how people can find you easily. And it also just kind of makes for a nice clean link for when you want to share it for other purposes as well. And the other thing as it pertains to that, this presentation isn't about your LinkedIn, but manage your LinkedIn the same way that you would your resume. Whenever you have new positions that come up or new experiences that come up that you think are relevant for an employer to know, especially if you're not actively on the job market, your LinkedIn is kind of your passive resume that gets passed around. Definitely keep that updated the same way that you would your resume. So then looking at the education section, people will follow different degrees of depth on this. Typically for us, because we usually don't have any professional experience yet, it's totally fair game to put your undergrad university as well as the university where you're doing your master's, your PhD, whatever it is you're working on. Within this section, you'll typically put name of the university, where the university is located, because they can have multiple campuses, degree type, perhaps what your specialization is, either the year that you've completed or the dates that you were attending. And then the rest of the information here is where people choose to get creative to their own comfort level. So you can choose to include test scores here. You can choose to include publications that you may have, grants that you've received. This is a good way to highlight those things without having to have someone go down to a achievements section to try and find those little details. They can quickly look at your academic record all in one place. Then comes the professional experience section. Same thing. You're going to want to include all of the pertinent details to where it was you worked. I, in particular, like this format where you have the name of the entity where you were working in sort of a bolded or more obvious text. And then below that, the position you have in italics. And the reason this works out nice is because if you look over here to the right side, along with the name of the company, you can, to the right side, have where it is located. And then with your position, you can easily put the years where you had that position. And then beneath each heading of your professional experience is where you're going to elaborate on what things were accomplished. And so you can see just from these two little examples here, we have a nice split of different types of active language. We have collaborate, perform, create, developed. These are really good communicators because they're directly hitting a lot of those skills that were listed in the job description without directly saying, effective communicator you could put on your resume. But instead, if I say collaborate monthly with 10 plus angel investors, it's implied that I had to communicate with those individuals in order to obtain some result. So this is a good starting example of how to sort of break down the information that you want to have in your resume. And then sort of the last summarizing overarching section, this thing that helps you give some personality to your resume. I think it's a good idea to have some type of section that's either your personal interests, or some people will make it skills, interests, maybe some additional information. But this is a good way to make yourself, I guess, more interesting is the best way to put it. Because the other way that you can look at this is, you're at Johns Hopkins University, you ultimately you're going to be submitting your resume alongside many of your peers, in addition to individuals from other high-class universities as well. And a lot of the experiences can start to look the same over time. a lot of people are going to have done a case competition. A lot of people are going to have done a pro bono project or gotten involved in some type of investing club. So sometimes this personal interest section is a good way for you to convey the person behind the application, which I think more and more, I mean, consulting firms, but really employers in general are becoming a little bit more interested in learning about their employees, because someone can be totally qualified to perform a job, but if they're not the most fun person to be around or the most fun person to work with, maybe, you know, we might take a chance on someone who has a little bit less experience, but ultimately will jive well with our team, and, you know, we'll be able to pick up some of those skills quickly on the other side. I know that this is true because when I was interviewing with one of my life science consulting firms, one of the partners that I interviewed with forewent asking me about the experiences on my resume and went straight down to my interest section and said, "Oh, you're interested in these things. I think we should talk about those before we do the case." And I was kind of caught off guard because I thought we would be talking about something, you know, tangible that I had done, but it was refreshing to know that they were interested in some of those extracurricular things, or even things that go beyond extracurriculars. Really, they were my hobbies. So don't assume that this is an insignificant section either. You know, the content that you put in these areas will get read if your interviewer is thorough enough. So at this point, I want to stop and go through an activity to take a look at a couple of resumes, but I want to pause to give everyone an opportunity to maybe ask questions or start submitting questions to the chat. I think is probably the best way to do that. So if you have any questions immediately at this point, you can go ahead and throw those in there. In addition to that, so what we're going to do now is sort of look through some examples of resumes that honestly came from a couple of online sources. It came from things that I've accumulated over time. And what I want to do is have a very informal sort of critique of those resumes. So I want us to play the role of a recruiter. So what we're going to do is every resume that I flash on the screen, we'll spend about a minute looking at each one. And I want everybody to kind of think about, you know, what are some of the pros of that resume? What are some of the cons of that resume? And then we can kind of get an idea of whether or not we would recommend that candidate be considered for a position. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. So thoughts about building a focused resume and dealing with time gaps. Yeah, that honestly, it depends on the nature of what types of gaps you might have in your experiences. Usually a good place to deal with any things that aren't easily conveyed on the resume is in the cover letter. And you can kind of play around with what content gets put in each document. If you find that you don't have enough room in your cover letter to convey something, or in your resume to convey something, you might be able to flow those over into your cover letter and really establish, you know, maybe an explanation of why you took some time off, or, you know, why you chose to go for a certain opportunity that you then left. Particularly people that, you know, went to med school and got an MD and are now deciding that after 2 years of practice, they want to be a consultant instead. You know, it's a really sought after job to be an MD, so they may want to explain why it is they're making that change. Should we put relevant coursework in the resume? Depends. If you're applying to a bigger consulting firm, if you've taken consulting classes, or, you know, business prep classes, I think it would be good to put those in there. And if you're applying to like a life sciences consulting firm, for example, and you've taken a class or two that you think is relevant for that, it can be good to include those either in the education section or maybe down with your additional skills. I don't know if I have examples of a mid-career professional, but I can try and see if I can find resources to help with that, if you connect with me afterwards. In terms of the ordering of sections, you can play around with what you think makes the most sense. Again, I mean, your recruiter is going to be looking at it potentially in a very quick amount of time. So you may decide, because especially if you don't come from a business background, that conveying your experience is the most important. You can put those first. I think traditionally most people put their education section first, but I have seen examples of people doing professional work experience before education. So recommendations for how to present past professional experiences that may not be very relevant or will way back in the past. I actually have a good example of that in my resume, so we'll talk about that when we get to that point. Okay, this is a good question too. So how can one best list the consultancy work that they have been involved alongside active employment? So I do have an example of that in my resume as well. I've done some pro bono work. You can either treat that as a professional experience, or you can treat that under a different heading if you choose to break up your sections that way. This is really where the creativity from that comes in. What I will say is you don't want to have your resume saturated with one type, right? So don't assume that because you're applying to a consulting firm that your entire resume should be examples of consulting experience. So if you've done lots of consulting related items, I would say maybe reserve just two main portions of your resume to those things and really give light to all the other things that you've accomplished. And if you feel that after you lay out, it's difficult to lay out all the things you've done in your life and decide, like quote unquote, what's the most important. But if you lay everything out and you decide, I'd like to really have a third consulting experience on there instead of, this other thing that I've done. Certainly if that's what your gut is telling you, do it. And then as you're going through the recruiting process, you can submit, to a resume professional or, someone you have in your camp that's helping you prepare, and they can give you their opinion on it as well. Okay, yeah. So another question about personal interests. Yeah, I mean, those can be good things to communicate if the work that you're planning to do is directly related to those things. If you have enough experiences that you can load your resume without talking about those things related to motherhood and child education, maybe you decide to really focus on those aspects as you're writing your cover letter. And you can still convey this narrative of, here are the experiences I've had. Here's, how I've taken this time to bolster these things. And here's why, the conclusions or the realizations I've had from studying those things has led me to want to do consulting, and why those experiences are going to be useful for me as a consultant. So again, there's a little bit of creativity in that way. Cool. So I just want to make sure that we'll have time to get through the examples. So here is the first example. So like I said, take a second to review this. We'll take about a minute to look this over and really try and draw some first impressions from this. Okay, so that's been about 45 seconds. We've already got some things coming through. Lots of graphics that don't really add much. The font is hard to read. The personal profile picture does not work. Keeping it cool. Yep. The resume language is not very professional. Cool. So I think everybody's getting the impression that maybe this isn't the best way to represent yourself. One thing I do want to point out, so for all of these, we're going to go through and look at sort of what things were done well and things that are good, because there are ultimately going to be some things on everybody's resume, regardless of how much time or ability they put into it, is helpful. So, someone talked about the how the skills section is interesting. Other people are criticizing it for the percentages. For someone in a design facet, it is interesting that this person recognizes that they're only, 35% proficient in Microsoft Office, which is an interesting way to present that. But, there actually is a decent amount of quantification within this person's skills, surprisingly more than I see from, my perspective comes from PhD students specifically in the sciences, but we really tend to neglect quantifying the experiences that we have. And then this person actually does a decent job of doing that, specifically in terms of monetary amounts. There are some outcomes listed. And one thing that is nice about this resume, if you look at sort of this profile section, some people do actually have that on their, professionally formatted resume, like a little blurb at the top that describes what position it is they're going for, or really quickly in a couple of sentences describes who they are. So that is actually something that you can consider if you're finishing up your resume and you've got a couple of lines and you're deciding, I don't really think I can fit another section here, and I don't think there's anything that I want to try and shove into this resume. You might decide to do something like that instead. It's the same way you have that special interest section. Having that line at the top does kind of separate you because most people won't have that section. But definitely for a lot of the reasons that people have already talked about, the sections of the resume are kind of lacking. First off, it's visually distracting. You spend so much time looking at the figures that once we have the full 45 seconds to look it over, you're almost spending so much time trying to process what all the images are, you don't really see the content that's on it. There's a lot of wasted space in this resume, particularly in this gray area down here and this second shading of the person's name. And as always, some deeper explanation of these experiences would be nice. Again, the quantification and some of the outcomes were there, but I think we could have expanded on these a little bit more. So let's do the same thing with this one. Okay, so that's about 45 seconds. So let's see. Centering makes it difficult to read. Bullets should be aligned, busy page. Education first, research come first. Put too many details. Okay, cool. Yeah, so same thing as before. There are some things that are good. So while they may not be organized in the way that we would like them to be, we've got a lot of not random things, but maybe not the most important things here at the top. The sections are labeled, and even though it's centered, there is some organization to it. At least they're consistent, I would say, is the critique that we can give to that. They do have a lot of diverse experiences, and for the position that they're probably applying to, there's a lot of relevant skills. That said, it is difficult to read because it's centered. I would say don't get overly creative with your resume. Think about the way we typically read, which is left to right, at least, for English reading. And so centering everything does make it really difficult to see how these lines come together. It also kind of makes it difficult to see where the breaks in the sections are. And the other thing that I think a lot of people notice, there's not really any quantification. There's not really a description of outcomes. This person is really just brain dumping. What have I done in terms of like being present and doing something, but not really giving us any context to understand what their contributions were to projects, how they bettered themselves, what skills they learned, that sort of thing. Okay, so I've got another one here. Let's take 45 seconds to look this one over and get some initial critiques. Okay, so that was our 45 seconds of review. It's definitely obvious that people don't have as many strict critiques of this one. You know, this one's starting to look a little bit more like the kind of resume we'd be looking for, right? So we've got nice formatting. Question about education doesn't need a year. It's a good idea to include education there. Cool, yeah. So a lot of this has to do with some of these finer details. So I would say, just looking at this from the outside in, from a science standpoint, this is a pretty decent resume, right? So this person is clearly applying for some type of potentially like an industry job. You know, they're putting out there how many internships they've have. But I think one of the things you might be realizing as you're reading through this is someone questioned 7 years of internship experience. Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at this, it's kind of distracting to say, wait, this person's been an intern for 7 years. Why did it take them so long to, you know, find a place to go? And, you know, maybe it's because they were working on some other things on the side. Maybe there's something that's not listed here, but then that means that thing should be listed here, or maybe they'll at least clarify it in their cover letter. Some of the things that are good about this, I think this is as close as we've gotten so far to the way we want our labeling to be. This person clearly has a lot of great experiences, and this layout is much more easy to read than the first two that we looked at. But obviously areas to improve, we have a lot of bullets under each thing. And if there are other experiences that this person has beyond being an intern, they've taken up a lot of space by putting 5, 6, 7 bullets beneath each of their headings. A lot of people pointed out that there wasn't any quantification. There are a lot of things unrelated to consulting. Like I said, this is something that you might see from someone who comes from a science background or a medical background that very blindly goes into their resume and says, here's what I've done. Like, this is my resume. And while you've done really awesome things, organizing them this way actually really isn't that helpful to someone who's specifically looking at it from a consulting lens. And then finally, I wanted to highlight down here at the bottom, the skills are a little bit too generic, right? They kind of hit some of these buzzwords like highly organized, computer savvy. I mean, those are examples of things that you can communicate through bullet points on your resume, right? Like, I might even just look at this and say, well, this person clearly has some organization because this resume looks really crisp and really clean. If they're computer savvy, maybe within one of their internship opportunities, they talk about either a script that they've written or, you know, the usage of Microsoft Office to improve a process, right? These are all things that can be conveyed in a different way, but still have the same message without having to take up multiple lines on a resume to do it, right? Because if we have those experiences up here, and then we also talk about being computer savvy down here, this computer savvy is a line on this resume that realistically could have been something else. And then lastly, we've got mine. So same thing, we'll take 45 seconds and be critical of this, right? Don't assume that because I'm here that you have to, you know, tone back criticisms of this. Okay, so that's 45 seconds. Do we have any criticisms? There are things that can be improved, even if it's something like you don't really like the formatting. Cool, random italicization, it's dense, I definitely agree with that. Phone number, address is incomplete. Cool, so hopefully, I think the point by showing this is not to seem, you know, self-centered, if that's the right way to say that. This resume was able to get me interviews with some of the big consulting firms and a couple of life science consulting firms. So I think as someone presenting, I can say I know that this format works. This is not the first iteration of my resume. The first iteration of my resume did not look like this, did not have this much quantification, and was not as successful at getting offers to interview. The main thing I think I'd like to highlight about this is the headings are consistent. I tried with every single point to almost have it be like a sentence that has its own idea that very clearly conveys what it is that I've done. And I've tried to hit all of the major areas of consulting within each of my experiences. I like this line here just under PhD candidate and the professional experience, because I received a fellowship from the NIH, and I could say like, oh, I received a fellowship from the NIH, but contextualizing the amount of money that is included in that fellowship, maybe having a line about the percentage of people that receive that fellowship, this much more directly conveys to someone who's looking at this from a business standpoint, and more directly conveys to them, you know, what the purpose of that bullet point is, what the significance of that bullet point is. And you can see examples of that all the way through. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, because people talked about experiences that were old, or so down here, when I was at the University of Delaware, I was a student engagement advisor, which is a step above resident assistant within the residence halls. I would say if you're coming directly, you're currently doing your master's or PhD and you just came from undergrad experience is totally fair, because again, you don't really have any true professional experience yet. Once you've gained some professional experience, you may play around with whether or not including undergrad positions is relevant. But this is an example of something where, you know, how is, you know, managing a hall of undergrad students at a university related to consulting? And I did that by talking about a budget that I managed, you know, directly quantifying how many people I was in charge of, both in terms of the staff that I was sort of overseeing as this promoted position, as well as the number of residents that we had in the halls, giving an idea of the number of outcomes from the standpoint of how many events that we planned. You know, all of these things are providing numbers to this job that initially, when you think about it on paper, you might say, well, that's not relevant at all. It has nothing to do with the life sciences. It has nothing to do with business. But when you really think about all of the things you did in those experiences, you can draw out some of those relevant points and really make it something that stands out a lot more than you would have thought initially. Areas that can be improved. I definitely agree with some of the people that have talked about this. It is a bit dense. There's a lot of information here. I certainly could have cut out one of these sections probably. My education section in particular could be pruned. Honestly, recruiters probably don't care about the name of my dissertation. I can probably take that out. Also, you know, some of these GPA points and things, like it might not be necessary to include those in there. And as always, there's always room to include more of the outcomes that come from each of the points on your resume. How did this impact someone? How was efficiency changed? Those types of things. But I would say in terms of, you know, getting your foot in the door and getting a chance to then interview and prove some of your skills at a company, this is a pretty good place to end. One thing I did want to point out, because we talked about this a little bit, is the headings of a resume are pretty fluid. So these are the headings I choose to use in my resume. I saw another format that I actually also really liked a lot. So, excuse me, instead of just having an education section, they called it education and awards. Then they have their work experience section. And then they have some of the headings that I have, but almost lump them together in ways that I think is really useful for spacing. I think if I organize my resume this way, it might help with that density issue. So this is why I'm saying, as you're writing your resume, go through multiple drafts of the same thing, but also go through, like, you make a draft, then make another one that has completely different headings, has things arranged in a completely different way, because, you know, you might like the way that that looks better. And so if you don't take anything else away from what we've talked about today, the main thing I want you to understand is, you know, there's a path to writing your resume. It starts with doing some of this upfront work and understanding what role you're qualified for and what specifically a company is looking for with someone in that role. But then recognizing the space in between where, you know, you're writing drafts of your resume, maybe you get a family member, a friend, a significant other to read it, and they give you some critiques and you come right back to square one and you start writing again, and maybe you go through some more drafting processes, but then you come back up to square one. You know, you're going to have several iterations of your resume in terms of different positions you're applying for, as well as, you know, reiterations of the same thing. And so some of the really important things that you want to keep in mind, and again, this may not be something that you're trying to get right off the get-go. Like your resume doesn't have to be perfect on the first draft because no one's ever is. But one thing is you can do to save yourself some editing time later. Definitely work on keeping your resume clear and formatted cleanly. Do not sell yourself short. So, don't assume because a resume or because an experience was done in undergrad, or, you kind of think that maybe it wasn't that big a deal. There's always ways to beef up a resume. I think the classic example I've seen is someone's like, how do you put Dungeons and Dragons on a resume and make it actually seem relevant or important? And you can talk about working as a team, skill building, creativity. Like there's a lot of things that can be pulled from any activity to fit a resume. And then adding in these quantification aspects is really where you can make those things pop. And then the big thing, again, because we're ultimately non-business people trying to communicate with business people, is think about the way that they think. They think in numbers, they think in concise phrases, and they really care about outcomes. What's the bottom line, right? So quantify your experiences where you can, and wherever possible, really convey, what benefit came from something, what initiative was started from something. Really demonstrate that why something was important. Because again, being in a different field, you may have accomplished something that's a really big deal, right? Like I would consider my fellowship to be that way. But if I just say that I got a fellowship, the person reading it may not understand that that's not just like a $1,000 fellowship that comes from a university for being a good student upon matriculation, right? So you really need to sometimes go out of your way to convey, here's why this particular line in my resume is so important, either by listing, total numbers of money, listing how many people you beat out to get that fellowship. Like anything that you can do to contextualize something is really good. And then finally, really make it yours. I mean, we went through so many iterations, and even the ones that we weren't super crazy about, they still had some good qualities to them that may make them stand out to someone, right? And ultimately, the sections that you include in your resume are the ones that you have decided are most important to convey to the employer, and that says just as much about you as the points on the resume. And so now I'll stop and take some time to answer questions. If you have questions and you can't stick around, feel free to hit my email here. Like I said, my LinkedIn is relatively easy to remember. It's just linkedin.com/n/Matt Hurlock. And if you're not already a member, like I said, I am the president of education for JHGCC. Our link there to join is at the bottom. It's really straightforward. You can also just go to our website and click the join. But thank you all for listening. I hope you got something out of the talk today, and I'm happy to stick around for a little while and answer any questions that people may have too.
Thank you so much, Matt. It looks like a lot of the people had put their questions up earlier, but definitely as he shared, feel free to follow up with him. Matt, are you able to share this slide deck?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay. So I will be reaching out to you all with a follow-up for today's sessions, and I will make sure to include the slide deck that Matt has. Thank you all so much for attending, and we really appreciate your insights on a consulting resume, Matt.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to provide any help. And like I said, if you want to get in touch, if anybody wants to get in touch with me later and talk about it further, I'm happy to make that happen.